This is Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany. Inspiring and providing real insight to our listeners with every story. Exploring deep stories behind every guest. Please welcome your host, Bo Tiffany.
Hey, Robert. How are you doing today? Thanks for coming back.
Terrific. Delighted to be with you, as always, Bo.
So what are we going to be talking about today? It's another hinge point of history, correct?
We are going to talk about the Battle of Blenheim today, and it's one of my favorites. And as you, Bo, and your Digital Voices listeners know, outside of my business careers, I've always been an amateur historian, and I've always been fascinated with what I call hinge points in history. These are instances, and there are many of them, where one person or one event, like a single battle, which could have gone either way, and many instances almost did go the other way, nevertheless changed the entire course of history. Everything that occurred after that was a direct result of that single transformative defining moment, that hinge point in history. Aside from hinge points that alter the course of history, there are also hinge points in our own personal lives as well. The poet Robert Frost perfectly captured this concept of personal hinge points in his famous 1915 poem, The Road Not Taken, which concludes, "I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference." We can each look at our own lives and see our own hinge points, decisions we made about where to live and what careers to pursue and who to marry, and many other decisions that, as we look back years later, made all the difference. On today's pod, Bo, we're going to talk about another one of these fascinating, true instances where one man or one battle changed the entire course of history. In today's case, the man is John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, the sixth great-grandfather of Winston Churchill of World War II fame. And the battle was the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. Now, you've probably never heard of this, and frankly, neither had I until a few years ago. I actually toured Blenheim Castle once in England, and I was aware, as many of us are, there was this battle called Blenheim, but I was unaware of the consequences or the significance of this. And the more I studied it, the more fascinating I found it. And I'm sure that you will too. So before we jump into the details, I want to step back for a moment and do some fun, deep philosophy with you. Will there even be such a thing as a hinge point, in the sense that we're talking about them here and understand them, which is where one man or a woman, through their own choices and voluntary actions, bent history from one outcome to another? That presupposes free will. It assumes that the way that history and human events unfold is not fixed. It's not preordained. Otherwise, it would make no sense to presuppose that anyone can or ever could change the course of history or even their own lives. Throughout history, some philosophers and writers have always thought of history, and indeed of our personal lives, not as a series of choices or events determined or made by individuals through free choice, but instead as a result of inevitable, unchangeable unfolding and progression of events, almost like a falling row of dominoes set in motion long ago toward a preordained outcome. And that outcome is the world we see today. Now, philosophers have several names from this viewpoint. They call it determinism or fatalism or predestination. Those who hold that view believes there's no free will, that the world we live in today is the result of this series of inexorable preordained events set in motion long ago that simply played themselves out down through history like a wind-up music box. Thus, under this view, we cannot, through our own choices, alter the world of tomorrow. And the notion of hinge points in history is illusory. This concept concept of predestination has been the fascination of not only philosophers, but of theologists and recently even physicists. Both the Quran and the Bible contain multiple verses, some of which appear to support predestination, while others seem to rebut that notion. The notion of predestination is a big feature in Hinduism and other religions. This topic has been the subject of a vast literature spanning millennia. This issue has been featured in many Hollywood movies. You may remember the 1962 Hollywood movie, Lawrence of Arabia, where Lawrence is told that he can't save this guy's life because it is written that he would have to die. Lawrence proceeds then to single-handedly go out into the desert and save this man. And as soon as he and his camel with his boy clinging to him arrive back into camp, they're met by this character played by Omar Sharif, the one who had earlier told Lawrence that it's futile to do anything to try to save this kid because his death is inevitable and unavoidable because it is written. This character offers Lawrence, on his return, played by Peter O'Toole, water. Lawrence takes this water pouch, but before he drinks, he looks at the Omar Sharif character hard in the eye, and then he sneers, "Nothing is written." Now, in 1687, Sir Isaac Newton, the famous English mathematician and physicist, wrote his famous treatise, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. Now, bear with me here. I'm not going to go too down in the weeds here, but this is important because it gives you the broad philosophical basis for this. Now, you just heard Lawrence of Arabia give the crying call for free will, and I want to tell you where a lot of the determinism got its grounding. And it came from Sir Isaac Newton, interestingly enough. His book is considered the most influential contribution of all time to our understanding and describing of the physical world. There, Newton set forth the principles and basic laws of mechanics, which include the laws governing the motions of objects and the forces acting on them. Newton described numerous mathematical formulas, and he provided them to precisely describe the behavior, momentum of physical objects under physical force. As an example, one of his laws was that the momentum of a body is the product of its mass times its velocity, P equals mv. There are many, many other examples in his works, but using these laws, the important takeaway here is you can exactly and precisely predict and know how physical things will behave once you set them in motion. Now, Newton's mathematical formulas and calculations came to be known as Newtonian physics. This model governed the entire world of science for well over 2 centuries, from Newton's time in the 17th century until well into the 20th century. Under the Newtonian model, atoms and molecules were considered to be analogous to solid particles like marbles, and they were believed to behave in the same way. In other words, the world was composed of a finite number of atoms, all of which were at all times moving in various directions at various velocities. And the Newtonian notion allowed many to follow the apparent logic of the Newtonian model to its logical conclusion, which is that we live in a deterministic world. They pointed out that under Newton's laws, if you could know with exact precision at an exact moment in time the position, motion of every atom in the universe, you could then, with that knowledge, if you had a big enough computer, by simple extrapolation, under Newtonian laws of physics, know the location where every other atom in the universe would be at any future point in time. In other words, you could know all future history, how it was going to turn out forever. Under Newton's law, this is a logically impeccable and necessary conclusion. A lot of people saw that, and there are no other possibilities. And you don't have to know the exact location or motion of every model for this deterministic conclusion to be true. The very fact that it could be known is enough. The broader implications are obvious and mind-boggling. For example, under this model, there's no such thing as free will. We have no ability to change the future in any way. Everything is already determined.
So, question really quick.
Okay.
How does that play into parallel universes? Because they always say that every option or every choice that could ever be made is made in some other parallel universe because there's an infinite number of them. So how does that play into the idea of parallel universes and having every possible outcome played out within parallel universes?
Well, the Newtonian model is that whichever universe you're in, which all these potentially infinite number of parallel universes, the whole game is set from the outset. Okay, the location and motion of all these atoms will enable you, if you knew them and you could put it in a supercomputer, you could predict the future for 1,000,000 years. You'd know who's going to win the Super Bowl 50 years from now, and so it doesn't, the fact that there are parallel or might be parallel universes doesn't really affect this theory, because in theory, it would apply to all universes if it was true, Newtonian model. And insofar as it went, at the time and with the measurements they had, it was true, okay? And it led people to take it to its logical conclusion that everything is preordained. And the notion has all kinds of implications, as you can obviously see, and it led theologians and scientists and philosophers to all kinds of hand-wringing and speculation for centuries, okay? Because if this deterministic model is true for one universe, it's true for all of them. And then what's left of the concept of free will in any universe, okay? If the future is preordained and it's preset, how can there be any free will? If there's no free will, what is left of the notions of sin? If God created us and the universe, and we have no free will in the world that he created for us, okay, aren't sinners preordained by God himself? And what sense does it make for God to consign sinners to hell if those sinners had no choice or moral culpability in choosing to be sinners in the first place? If we have no free will, then it isn't our fate to be sinners, or our fate to be sinners is just preordained. It's something completely outside the concept of choice, which is essential to the notion of sin. And so there can be no moral culpability under the deterministic for sin or crime or wrongdoing, because we're just destined. We can't change it. Now, where did this all go? Okay, this is really heavy stuff here. It really pinned people into this very disturbing notion of determinism. And then in the early 20th century, along comes the Germans, and they step forward with a definitive answer to this theological dilemma, this conundrum of free will. In 1927, a generation out of quantum physics were first discovered. Max Planck, another German physicist, and another quantum physics discovered by Max Planck around the turn of the century. Then another German physicist, Werner Heisenberg, in 1927 published his famous uncertainty principle. There, he pointed out the real meaning and significance of quantum physics. He explained it to us, which is that matter itself are not little marbles like atoms who behave in predictable ways according to the normal laws of thermodynamics and Newtonian physics. They are not. Instead, at the atomic level, there's nothing solid. Atoms are not marbles. They're just fuzzy energy fields, which flit about randomly and unpredictably. And as a result, the exact location and direction and energy level of atoms cannot ever be measured, let alone known. The implications of that are profound in lots of ways, okay? Not the least of which on the notion of predestination. For their work, Max Planck and Werner Heisenberg were awarded the Nobel Prizes in physics. And so what does this quantum physics notion do to the idea of predestination in a deterministic universe, okay? The answer is simple. It blows the whole notion out of the water. And I find it fascinating, and I think that you listeners will too. It's how the fact that there are hinge points in history, the fact that there are hinge points in history itself shows how wrong the predestination point of view is. The wonderful and the fascinating truth is that there's nothing inevitable and preordained about how the world turned out or what the future holds. In fact, there are many instances throughout history which I've mentioned earlier, and the ones I call hinge points in history, that themselves prove that nothing is preordained, because one person or the outcome of one battle or a single event can and repeatedly has changed the entire course of history. Most, but not all, of these hinge points were military battles, and often those battles were close, and the ultimate winner went into battle as an outnumbered underdog. And if the battle had gone the other way, which in many cases they almost did, the world that we live in today would be vastly different than it actually is. And the very fact that this is so, that there could be hinge points in history, shows that the future is not preordained or predetermined. Everything is in our hands. As the great English poet William Ernest Henley wrote in his great poem Invictus, I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. That is the cry of free will. This is an ennobling and an empowering thought for all of us to bear in mind. We have in our own hands the power to change not only our own lives, but the entire direction of history and the world itself. To give you a clearer idea of what an actual hinge point history looks like, let me whet your appetite here for what's to come in this podcast with two fun and dramatic examples of what some early but well-known hinge points in history, okay? We're going to start with the Battle of Marathon, okay? This is just an example. I get to Blenheim here shortly, okay? The Battle of Marathon occurred way back in 490 BC. This epic battle is widely viewed by many historians as one of the most, if not the most, consequential and heroic military victories of all time. At stake was the homeland of Athens. And really, more to the point, what was really at stake, what we now call Western civilization versus Persian despotism. The entire Athenian army at that point numbered only 11,000 men. It was governed and led by 10 Athenian generals, one for each of the 10 tribes that made up Athenian society. All of these military leaders were treated as equal, and all major decisions about war were made jointly by all of them by a democratic vote. There was also an 11th leader, a magistrate they call the polemarch, or the war leader. In this case, the war leader's name was Callimachus, and he oversaw the entire army. And in the rare event that there was a tie vote among the Athenian generals, he and he alone was entitled to cast the tie-breaking vote. While it was in Athens, the Greek army suddenly and unexpectedly received word that a vast Persian expeditionary force, an army of 40 to 60,000 soldiers with another 40,000 camp followers and slaves, had just landed on the coast of the nearby plains of Marathon, less than 30 miles northeast of Athens. Went without saying, this arriving army was there to prepare to march on Athens and to destroy it. The Athenian generals then rushed their army to high ground overlooking the plains of Marathon, where they could see with their own eyes the fleet of 600 warships on the shores of the Peloponnesian coast. They were unloading an immense invading Persian army. At this point, the 10 Athenian generals engaged in an earnest and intense discussion about whether to stay and fight the Persians there on the plains of Marathon, or to retreat and defend Athens itself. They split 5-5 as to whether to retreat to Athens or stay and stage a surprise attack on the vastly numerically superior Persian army massing below them. The war leader, Callimachus, listened intensely to these generals' debate. Then he broke the tie, voting that the army should immediately attack and fight to the death, if necessary, to defend their Athenian homeland. In all human probability, on this one vote, by this one man, the destiny and the values of what we now call Western civilization hung in the balance. And of course, a course of action now decided The Greek army quickly assembled in their signature phalanx formation, where they held up their shields and they held their swords in the other hand, and they locked arms, and they jogged down from the mountains and into the plains of Marathon and headed directly into battle. On the Greek side were 11,000 men defending the European values of philosophy, democracy, liberty, the equality of civil rights. On the Asiatic side was King Darius and 40 to 60,000 soldiers fighting for Persian despotism. This Greek army, with no cavalry, having plunged down from the heights on foot into the plains of Marathon, stormed right into the Persian lines, hacking the first rows of surprise defenders to pieces. The immense numerical superiority of the Persian forces, however, enabled them to absorb this initial shock and regroup. And eventually, after hours of hand-to-hand combat, the Persians broke through a small portion of the Greek lines and forced the Greeks to retreat back up to high ground. But there, the Greek flanks expertly and successfully surged inward, reestablishing the army's famed phalanx. And the battle shifted again in favor of the Greeks. The Greeks then slowly pushed the Persians back down into the plains. And ultimately, after many back and forths, the Greek pushed the invaders into the sea. They even seized 4 Persian ships, burning many others at anchor. When it was all over, 6,400 Persians lay dead against only 192 Greeks. The Persians had been dealt a far-reaching and humiliating defeat. Then, to inform Athens of this great victory, a messenger named Philippides was designated to race this incredible news to eagerly awaiting Greek assembly in Athens, a distance of just over 26 miles. Philippides ran the whole way, entered the assembly, and shouted, "We have won!" before collapsing and dying. It was to commemorate this heroic event that we now have the modern marathon race. The first such modern marathon race was held in 1896 in Athens in honor of Philippides. The marathons now are run the same distance as run by Philippides all over the world in races held all over the world. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Mitchell and Sir Edward Creasy, the authors who wrote the great classic war anthology, 20 Decisive Battles of the World, referred to this as one of the greatest, which was one of the greatest military treatises of all times, had this to say about the Battle of Marathon. This profound victory generated among the Greeks the spirit that later defeated the Persian general Xerxes and resulted in securing for mankind the intellectual treasures of Athens and the growth of free institutions, the liberal enlightenment of the Western world, and the gradual ascendancy for many ages of the great principles of European civilization. Thus, on this hinge point hung in the balance the values of Western civilization versus Persian despotism. There, at Marathon, the Greek side, the representative of Western civilization, won. And that's why we consider it a great hinge point of history. Now let's turn to another fun hinge point, the Battle of Ethandune, or as some historians call it, the Battle of Edington, which took place in 878 AD. In the 9th century, Denmark invaded England, and its huge army quickly overthrew the various small Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, one by one, until only one kingdom, the kingdom of Wessex, remained unconquered. It looked to everyone that nothing could stop this much larger force of conquering Danes from sweeping all the way to the southern border of England and annexing the entirety of England to Denmark. That, in fact, is what they intended to do. At this point, to make matters even more dire for the English, their Saxon leader was killed in battle. It was at this low point, with their armies in disarray, that the few remnants of the defeated Saxon armies of the 12 kingdoms all fled to a remote swamp off the southern coast of England. There, at night, by bonfires, a new Saxon king was appointed. He was a young man named Alfred. Alfred quickly moved to inspire these dispirited soldiers, helping them rearm themselves and motivating them to fight for their homeland. He shaped them quickly into a fighting army and developed a bold plan to attack the Danish army. Alfred had learned that the Danish soldiers typically partied far into the night until they collapsed eventually in a drunken stupor. So Alfred cleverly planned to attack the Danes, the much larger Danish army, at dawn when they were passed out drunk and hopefully in the poorest condition to fight. Alfred assembled and readied his new army, and then at first light in a meadow called Ethandune, 30 miles southwest of what is now London, on a cold spring morning in May 878 AD, Alfred's screaming Saxons ran out of the dark forest, their sharpened, gleaming swords held high, and set upon these sleeping Danish invaders. The plan worked. Many of the Danes, still in drunken stupor, were hacked to pieces, and the rest fled, leaving everything behind. The Saxons then succeeded in pushing the entire, much larger Danish army northward for hundreds of miles. Alfred and his Saxon army soon recaptured London, as well as other Saxon strongholds. And this inspired further Saxon resistance everywhere and their renewed spirit as the Saxons, joined by other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, began to rouse the Danes from their conquest all over southern England. Alfred later became referred to by historians as Alfred the Great. He is the only Englishman ever to be granted the title Great. Eventually, the Danes, reinforced by additional Danish soldiers coming down from Denmark southward, reestablished themselves at an old Roman road that dissected England's midsection, northwest to southeast. There, neither side, despite months of indecisive, bloody struggles, was able to gain the upper hand. So here, the two sides eventually negotiated a peace treaty. Under the terms of the treaty, the Saxons agreed to cease all attacks on the Danes, provided that they agreed to remain north of this Roman road, which became known as the Danelaw line. This treaty and ceasefire were completely successful in halting the Danish advance and stopping the violence. However, within a generation, this treaty's segregation terms were totally ignored. Danish migrants began crossing the Danelaw line through the forests and wild lands all over the middle of England, heading southward, unresisted, where they eventually established farms and settlements all over southern England. At the same time, the Saxon families displaced by the Danish invasion returned north to their former homes and villages north of the Danelaw line. Over the next century or so, the Danish migrants established themselves in towns and farms all over England, in many cases, right next to existing Anglo-Saxon farms and towns. The original friction between these nationalities just melted away, and they began to integrate their cultures and their civilizations. Danish girls and boys found their English counterparts irresistible, and vice versa, leading to an astonishing rate of intermarriage. After a century or so, this led to something that never happened before, the merger of two separate independent languages, Old Norse, spoken by the Danes, and Old English, spoken by the Anglo-Saxons. These languages merge into a single new language, which we call today Middle English. In sum, Alfred's exhorting his Saxon brethren to resist the seemingly certain and unstoppable victory of the invading Danes, and organizing and leading them to a huge upset victory at Ethandune was a hinge point in history. But for Alfred and his victory that day, that cold morning in 878 AD, we'd all be speaking Danish today, or at least some version of Old Norse. At the time of this battle, English, or it was Old English then, was spoken by less than 200,000 people. Historians agree, there's no question, but that a Danish victory, Ethandune, would have completely eradicated English. It would have become relegated to being one of many hundreds of the world's forgotten and no longer spoken languages lost to history. But today, English is the most spoken language in the world, with a combined native and non-native 1.2 billion speakers. You can go to any big city in the world today and find a lot of people speak English. English is taught to all students in secondary schools throughout Russia, China, India, Japan, Europe. In many other places around the world, English has become the world's second language. It is the language of international conferences. The International Civil Aviation Organization, which controls the skies, mandates that English is required to be spoken in every airplane in the sky all over the world. If you're in a Russian airplane over Moscow, speaking to other Russian airplanes or the Russian tower, you have to speak to them in English. English is the language of computers. It's a required language, it's required of all contracts and business agreements and the 27 nations of the European Union. So now you can see why the Battle of Ethandune was such a crucial hinge point in history. Now we're ready for today's fascinating hinge point, the Battle of Blenheim. And now you've had a taste of what these hinge points are. I think you're going to really appreciate this. You probably never heard of this battle, the Battle of Blenheim. Frankly, that's why I picked it, because I hadn't heard of it either until I discovered it a few years ago and was fascinated by it. And I'd been in Blenheim Castle in England, and I knew that there was this battle called the Battle of Blenheim, because that's where the place got its name, and it was against the French, and it was. But I really didn't understand the consequences of it and the significance of it until I began to research it. I think you'll find it, as I did, incredibly fascinating. So to help you appreciate this hinge point, and let me help you with some background here. Until the last 100 years, European countries were ruled by kings and queens. Succession, that is, who would rule next after the death of a monarch, was nearly universally determined by hereditary succession. Over the centuries, the arbitrary hereditary nature of succession in the monarchs of Europe produced a number of bizarre and disruptive shifts in power. After the death of a monarch, the designation of the person next in line to be king or queen is obviously a matter of momentous importance to that monarch's country. But the manner in which these monarchs had established to make that decision was not to decide it or shape it by any form of consensus or public will or democratic means, or even of logic, and least of all, any consideration of the talent or merit of the new monarch. Instead, it was always solely the outcome of the arbitrary rules of hereditary succession to make this momentous decision. And if there was no hereditary heir, then the crown would be placed on the successor at the unfettered designation of the reigning monarch, him or herself. Throughout large portions of the 17th century, England had been racked by civil war and religious turmoil, which weakened its power. It was during the same period that England and its ally, the Netherlands, watched with great apprehension as their arch rival France, under its new great leader, Louis XIV, who was called the Sun King, and who was coronated when he was only 5 years old in 1643, continued to amass power and gain territory. King Louis XIV introduced many economic reforms that expanded the already flourishing French economy. But a particular concern to the more liberal societies of England and Netherlands was Louis XIV's obsession with promoting his reactionary political theory that only monarchs should rule, and they should be entitled to absolute, unfettered power. During the early decades of his reign, Louis XIV had managed to eviscerate the power of the French Parliament itself. And he also eviscerated the rights of the royal judges, the nobles, the provincial political elites, and even the rights of the common people. This ensured that none of them would ever again be able to resist his royal authority. One of the many ways in which Louis expanded his royal authority was to make every important public office in France one that he and he alone could appoint or fire, and thus he was able to force his will, the will of the monarchy, into every nook and cranny of even French provincial life. If this wasn't concerning enough, throughout the latter part of the 17th century, Louis snatched and annexed provinces and principalities all along the northern eastern border of France, making them part of an ever-expanding and strengthening France. All this caused the English, and indeed much of Europe, to view Louis XIV and the rising power of France as a threat to the liberties of Europe in general, and England and the Netherlands in particular. Bear in mind that Spain, too, was also a fierce rival of both the Netherlands and England, and that bitter and deep rivalry was both religious as well as nationalistic. Spain was a deeply Catholic country, and England and the Netherlands were the great centers of Protestantism. And the hatred of each other, of those two great sects of Christianity, was so fierce and merciless, it's hard for us to even fathom it in today's world. I'll give you one example. Between 1618 and 1648, half of the entire population of what is now Germany, one of the most populous countries in Europe, slaughtered the other half in a series of vicious sectarian attacks, as both Catholics and Protestants set upon each other's villages, slaughtering men, women, and children with abandon. In 1588, Catholic Spain had launched a huge armada of ships called the Spanish Armada to invade England and to hang Queen Elizabeth I, its Protestant queen, and crush Protestantism. The invasion was so huge and so well equipped that it could clearly and would have clearly and easily succeeded in crushing England, by far the most powerful and the richest of the Protestant countries. If that had happened, the Catholic side in this long-running and bitter religious schism between Catholic and Protestant would have prevailed, and if they could crush Protestant, and they would have crushed the Protestant world and everything the Protestant world stood for. Philip II, the Spanish king, had long vowed to crush science as well as all independent thoughts as heresy, and to bring the whole of Christendom back under the pre-Martin Luther Catholic orthodoxy. But for two sudden storms which blew out of the northwest as the Armada approached the English coast, Philip would have achieved his aims. Historians Riley calls these storms the Protestant wind. The first storm blew out of the west and nearly blew the Armada into the French coast. All the while this was happening, English ships were sinking the Spanish galleons with their far superior naval cannons. This and the severity of the storm persuaded the Armada's leaders to abandon their mission and to return to Spain by sailing north counterclockwise around the British Isles. Then, just as the Armada turned to the corner at the north side of Scotland, it was hit by another storm, this one also out of the northwest and even more ferocious. The second storm was so severe that it blew about a third of the Armada's entire fleet of ships onto the rocky coast of Scotland, where those ships were torn apart by the rocks and the pounding surf. There, those hapless sailors and soldiers were thrown into the raging surf, and then as they tried to struggle onto the beaches, they were hacked to pieces by the local Protestant inhabitants. The remaining Armada ships limped back to Spain, never to return to battle England. But for these storms, history would have unfolded in a radically different way than the course it took. Many believe that this was the greatest hinge point in all history. After the defeat of the Armada, neither the Catholics nor the Protestants were ever again able to gain dominance or hegemony. For the next 100 years or so after the defeat of the Armada, the two sides continued to slaughter each other with ferocious, endless, bloodthirsty religious wars. However, neither side could gain any form of hegemony or dominance. At length, both sides grew weary, and they began looking for some way to live together without this bloodshed. The only solution, of course, was religious and ultimately political tolerance. But this was anathema to the religious leaders on both sides. They all believed what we now call the values of the honor culture, which is that if you disagree with me, I have to kill you. Both Protestants and Catholics believed that if their neighbors or those in another country were violating Holy Scripture, in other words, if they were committing heresy as they saw it in any of its many forms, it was their sacred duty to kill them. But exhaustion and a sense of futility eventually began to take hold. And by the end of the 17th century, in place of religious fervor and intolerance, the philosophy of tolerance had begun to gain a foothold in these great European powers. And that concept continued to grow and expand into the political realms as well. Today, we know, not only science, but our deeply held values of religious and political tolerance, which are enshrined in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, to the failure of the Spanish Armada. To this day, political and religious tolerance is the simple and most salient feature of the difference between what we now call the West and the rest of the world, in particular, China and Russia. There, if you disagree with the government in Russia or China, they kill you or imprison you. Now, back to 1700. While the Armada failed in 1588 to conquer England, Spain remained and was still at 1700 an enormously powerful country, and it still held vast territories. To give you an idea of just how much of the world Spain held at the beginning of the 17th century, 100 years after the Armada, Spain still ruled and owned parts of the Netherlands, all of Sardinia, all of Sicily, the Kingdom of Naples, the Duchy of Milan in the northern part, the richest part of Italy, the Philippine Islands, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Florida, Mexico, Central America, and the largest part of South America. Imagine that vast realm and its immense wealth. Now, almost from his childhood, the deepest held ambition of the French King Louis XIV was to acquire for France this vast empire of Spain and join it to France in a world-dominating French hegemony. This was no secret. Louis XIV made this clear in his intentions, and just the thought of it was enough to cause night sweats on the part of the Dutch and the English, and even the Austrians. As the 17th century drew to a close, a sudden and unexpected change in the succession of the King of Spain made this Anglo-Dutch nightmare move much closer to becoming a reality. The Spanish King Charles II had no heir, and he grew deathly sick. But before his death, he suddenly named, of all people, Philip Anjou, Louis XIV's grandson, to succeed him. Then Charles II died in 1700. Here is what historian Alison Weir had to say about this development. Spain had threatened the liberties of Europe at the end of the 16th century. France had all but overthrown them at the close of the 17th. What hope was there of being able to make headway against both France and Spain, united under such a monarch as Louis XIV? There, in her words, you have the threat spelled out. A grave threat to nearly all the values of England and much of that Europe held dear. Here looming was a threat even worse than that posed by the Spanish Armada. Consistent with what historian Alison Weir's characterization, which is how everybody saw it at the time, this development caused total panic in London, in Amsterdam, and fury in Vienna, since Austrian Archduke Charles viewed himself, certainly not Philip of Anjou, as the legitimate claimant to the Empire of Spain. Immediately, the English king, William III, raced to form a grand alliance against France. That included England, Holland, Austria, and some of the German principalities. Then in 1802, while he was just getting started in this, the English king, William III, the leader and guiding light of this new allied league, died. This created a sudden and great uncertainty about what was going to happen next, this new alliance, especially since the new English Queen Anne was not known. But almost immediately, Anne reassured everybody by unequivocally declaring her intention to adhere to the Grand Alliance and support all of the measures planned by her predecessor, King William III. She even picked the same man that William III had recommended to oversee the job, John Churchill. He was soon to become famous through history and the world as the first Duke of Marlborough. John Churchill was the sixth great-grandfather of World War II Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Having a man for this enormous, rapidly approaching life and death struggle already selected and ready was extremely fortuitous, as the vast war was declared shortly after in 1802. It was in this conflict that John Churchill proved to be one of the most able and capable military commanders in history. Not only were his military talents unrivaled, but his diplomatic skills were unrivaled. The alliance was overseen on the Dutch and Germanic side by seemingly unworkable patchworks of government agencies in Holland and among the Germanic allies, whose approval Churchill had to get before he could undertake any actions. Managing this required extremely enduring patience, and an intuitive ability to judge who could be trusted, and a resourcefulness combined with unrivaled diplomatic skills. But Churchill quickly demonstrated he was up to this gargantuan job. He so impressed the Dutch that they placed all of his troops under his control, as did the Germanic princes. This was an incredible feat. Then Churchill's supreme talents as a military commander were revealed as he led the Allied army of 56,000 against a slightly larger and enormously experienced and well-funded French and Bavarian force of 60,000 men. During the first 2 years of this war, from 1702, this truly international war raged in ferocious but limited campaigns in Italy, Bavaria, France, Austria, and Holland. None of these battles and skirmishes was decisive in the overall outcome. Then, in 1704, the final climactic campaign began, one that the rival nations and their leaders had long planned, and the culmination of all that had gone on before. With all of Europe holding its breath, Marlborough led the Allied troops down into the heart of Europe from Amsterdam to engage the French army, which paralleled his movements coming down from Brussels. The two armies began a series of ferocious engagements north and east of the Black Forest. Then they maneuvered east into Bavaria, then north into the Rhine and the Danube rivers. Marlborough, one of the greatest and most storied military campaigns in history, consistently outmaneuvered, surprised, and confounded his highly experienced French counterparts, Generals Villeroy and Talon. He weaved in and out of battles. He stopped and halted in mid-battle, then suddenly attacked again. In one case, he started a surprise attack at 2 a.m. The climactic end of this astonishing and profoundly decisive military campaign took place in the Battle of Blenheim, named for this little village on the Danube River around and where the final battle took place. In this engagement, Marlborough's soldiers and cavalry either brilliantly outmaneuvered and surrounded the French forces, forcing them to surrender, or else they completely annihilated them in frontal and enveloping attacks. When it was all said and done, Churchill's and his allies had lost only 4,500 men with 7,500 wounded out of an initial force of 56,000. While the French losses were never fully known, the French were never able to assemble more than 20,000 of the original 60,000 who initially began the battle. This means that 40,000 French soldiers were killed, wounded, captured, or missing. The principalities of Ulm, Landau, Tarac, and Terre were surrendered to the English, and all of Louis XIV's conquests in Germany were severed from France and once again returned to their sovereignty. The war went on for another year or two, but for the rest of the war, Louis XIV fought only in defense. The military ascendancy of the Allies was established. The Sun King's profound and decisive defeat at Blenheim dissipated forever his once proud visions of acceding to the Spanish possessions through alliance with his grandson, and thereafter joining in the ultimate conquest of the French, the English, the Dutch, the Austrian, and his German rivals. Blenheim, simply put, deprived the Sun King of the military capability they needed to succeed in his Europe-dominating ambitions. This war, which became known as the War of Spanish Succession, did continue on for a while on a very small scale, but quickly France sought peace. There were a great number of questions raised by the failure of the powers to agree on Philip's status. Thus, a number of the key and effective nations in Europe set up a long series of negotiations that resulted in a bunch of treaties, all of which were subsumed under what came to be called the Peace of Utrecht. All were motivated by the prospect that continued to haunt Europe that Spain and France would merge. So finally, in 1713, France and Spain were forced by England, Sardinia, Portugal, Savoy, and the Netherlands to sign the main treaty of Utrecht. wherein representative both Louis XIV and Philip of Anjou, who became known as Philip V of Spain, they all both signed it and required them to permanently renounce on the French side any claim, on the Spanish side any claim to the French throne, and Louis required Philip of Anjou to permanently renounce any claim to the French throne, and Louis XIV to renounce any claim to the Spanish throne. This ended this conflict by foreclosing the prospect, and which created the conflict in the first place. It is important to contemplate again just how much was at stake in this conflict. It's not an exaggeration to say that our entire notions today of political liberty, freedom, and the right of political and religious expression hung in the balance. Had France won the Battle of Blenheim, it would be able to consolidate its power with Spain's, indeed merge with Spain, thereby acquire all of the Spanish territorial conquest. And then, as the historian Alison Ware points out, it is impossible to imagine how the Allies would have been able to resist that new superpower that would have emerged, or even how they would have been able to survive as independent nations, or more importantly, in a world in which Louis XIV could dominate in that degree, how our notions today of political and religious liberty would have survived and flourished as they do today in what we now call the West. This is what was decided by the Battle of Blenheim, and why it's one of the great hinge points in history. And this outcome is yet another example showing that determinism is wrong, as evidenced by how one single man, John Churchill, single-handedly changed the course of history.
Well done, Robert. You know, I always enjoy these hinge points of history, these set of unique circumstances that created the world as we know it in the way that we know it. And these forgotten or often forgotten tidbits that you share with us really is a treat, because it opens our mind and it reminds us also where we came from and how we got to be.
I think that that you're absolutely touched on the thing that excites me about it the most, which is that the world that we live in today is in many ways an historical accident. And in many ways, it is the result of the efforts by one man here and one man there. And if they hadn't done this and did what they did and had not turned out, we were living in a very different world, you know. And there's nothing, people think this is just the unnatural unfolding of events that would have happened this way no matter what. No, it would have been something unimaginably different and something antagonistic, an anathema to the principles and the values that we hold dear today in what we call the West.
Whether it's chaos theory or, you know, predetermination, or I think there's interesting tidbits to take out of that. And I liked how your examples that you gave early on show that predetermination really isn't a thing. You know, it doesn't exist. I think there's a good argument that you made for that.
Well, you know, after Newtonian physics became a thing, if you take the logic of it and you really sit down and take it out to its logical conclusion, the logical conclusion, which is scientific and logically impeccable, is determinism. And this troubled thinkers and people for centuries. You know, wait a minute, you know, if this is true, you know, that means that, you know, I may not know it, I may not be able to know it, but somewhere it has already been decided what's going to happen, and so everything is futile. And there are cultures in the world that believe in this futility, believe that, you know, everything is already decided, it's written, and you don't need to do it because it's going to be God's will and all that stuff. And that ain't so. And what is interesting to me is these Germans come along in the beginning of the 20th century, and they come up with a hard scientific, verifiable theories of why it's not true and why Newtonian physics only applies to aggregate massive bodies, millions of atoms, and that behavior. It does not apply at the subatomic level, which rebuts completely this notion that if you could know all this stuff, you couldn't. You can't know it, and you couldn't predict it because it's all random, and therefore there is free will, and it's all up in the air. And I think that's a very ennobling and empowering concept, to think that we have in our hands, we are the masters of our fate and the captains of our soul. We can change things. We can change things not only in our own lives, but potentially, in the world at large. And I think that's an extremely empowering and exciting and favorable thought to have in mind.
Absolutely. Carpe diem. Seize the day.
Seize the day.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to our next cast, which you already have planned for us. Do you want to give us a sneak peek on that?
Well, I have been working on some models of how did we get in this fine mess we're in politically in the United States. Okay. And I'm working on, I think a podcast should have, it should reach conclusions or insights or solutions, and that's where I'm kind of a little hung up, I'm waiting for the muse to visit me on this. She hasn't yet. She did visit me on this last podcast, and I'm stuff just came to me, all these ideas, and they all came together. So I'm waiting for her to return here and give me, because I don't think it's, I think it might be interesting to analyze where the antecedents of today's mess came from and how we got here and what it means in many ways. But that's not, I don't think, useful enough to be satisfying to me. I want to be able to offer, as I did with the one about the police misconduct. I brought that to a simple solution in plain sight that has been tried in California and works like a charm and could work everywhere, and it would be consistent with everyone's values and everybody would win. And so I brought to the table something that works. And here's the problem, and here's the solution for it. And it's real simple. And here's the proof it works. I'm still, I think it's a tall order to do. How are we going to solve the world's problems today? Maybe it's enough to have some insights of where those may come from. I was talking to my wife about this morning. He says, well, you just gave the thing about how, some leader can come along and change the course of history. And I said, well, I'm not sure how satisfying it is to say that, we have to depend on some person in the future to perform some miracle on the lines of the Battle of Blenheim or Ethan Dune to come and save us from our fate here. That's not really a solution. That's we just wait till somebody solves it for us, But I would like to be able to shine some light on this, okay? And that's a big order. And I think your listeners don't want to just hear what I have to, they already know how screwed up it is, and it might be interesting to hear some of my insights about that. But what they want to hear and what I want to hear is how are we going to get out of this mess? Something that's viable and we can look at it and we could say, I could see that as a possibility, as something we could work toward that would solve this problem,
And I would say one of the things to think about is, can we? I think there's an inherent,
is what I'm sorry
is can we, are we able to? We need to evolve as a species in terms of our mental capacity. So one thing that we have stuck with us is my guest that I had on wrote a book called The Molecule of More, which is about dopamine and how that shaped us culturally through history. And dopamine kind of goes hand in hand with greed. And, you see greed throughout the ages where there's, that 1% that holds 99% of the pie. And then the commoners or the lessers are meant to share up the rest. And we just had the largest transfer of wealth in human history just occur. So I think it's one of those things that are on a lot of people's minds of, when you're talking about what do we do? How did we get here? Where do we go from here? We just spent trillions of dollars. And when you actually try to think about what $1 trillion actually is and how much that is, it's almost unfathomable how much money that actually truly is. And so we have put ourselves in this situation, especially with inflation and recession and all the things that we're currently experiencing because of the choices that we've made throughout recent history, So those are things I think would be fun to talk about too, or incorporate a little bit into that.
Those are topics that definitely speak to me. I believe that we have pulled back government funding on universities, and made them incredibly expensive. Today, we have 44 million young people with 1.6 trillion debt. And I think that's a form of economic suicide. And my niece lives in Denmark, and they pay her $1,000 a month to get a degree. And so they're investing in their infrastructure instead of stifling it on their young people. And we gave our 650 billionaires more than 1.7 billion, enough to pay off all this in the last few years in giveaways and tax credits for 650 people who are billionaires. That will go down in history as one of the great follies, and there are many of them. But I am completely in tune with you on that. I just want to make one final comment on that picture behind you there. Over on your right, my left, okay, just above the bridge there, you can see the Berkeley Hills back there. And I came here when I was 19 years old, and spent a whole summer going all around the Bay Area to the beaches, and here at the very spot here on the headlands and all around. And when it was getting time to go back, I went there and climbed up the top of one of those hills there, and this great view, and watched the sunset over the Golden Gate Bridge, and saw this great view in the blue and the forest of Marin and everything. And as I sat there, it suddenly hit me. I was a student at the University of Illinois then, in Champaign-Urbana, and it hit me that I'm just going to come back out here and seek my fortune right here. And I did. I went back and transferred to Cal Berkeley, and got a degree in philosophy, and went to law school, and I spent the rest of my life here. And that was 54 years ago. I don't know how that's possible.
And that's close to the spot that I have for my backdrop, where you made that decision?
Yeah, it was just off. You could see it from here. It brought that to mind.
For our listeners, I have a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge up, kind of similar to the Grateful Dead spot. There's a park. You might be able to describe this area better, Robert, considering you live. This
is the headlands on the north side of the Golden Gate Bridge. You're looking back across the bay to San Francisco and over the Golden Gate Bridge, and on the horizon is you can see a piece of Alcatraz Island, and then behind that, the Blue Hills, which is the Berkeley Hills in the East Bay, and above the University of California, and that's where this happened. You can see it from here. That's why it brought it to mind. This is a picture taken at dawn, at sunrise, and you can see the sun coming up there over the city.
Well, Robert, I thank you, as always. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. I think the insights that you've given us in the history has been tantalizing and thought-provoking, which is the goal of what we do here. Try to stimulate your mind, listeners, and get us thinking. So I can't wait till our next podcast together. Anything you'd like to say before I let you go?
No, I'm enjoying this, and I think that it's interesting to me, and it's interesting to you, and I hope and I believe it's interesting to your listeners as well. Absolutely. And I look forward to more of these.
Sounds great. Have a great day. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye.
This has been Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany, exploring deep stories from real-life guests with real-life experiences, providing insight to our listeners with every story. Stay up to date on future podcasts by bookmarking Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany.podbean.com, and follow Bo on social media by searching Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany. Have an idea for a future story? Send your idea to acrmadison@gmail.com. Until next time, grab life by the horns and keep inspiring others.